Thank you, Mary. You know, there's a one-line joke, and you're going to have to forgive me if this is a little bit nerdy or a little bit geeky, but it goes like this. There are three types of people in the world. There are people who are good at math, and there are people who are not good at math. What I'm going to be doing for the first part of the 12 minutes I have is talking about three groups of people that I think we would be very well served to keep in mind when we start thinking in terms of changing the world. Now that's going to be difficult for us. Not that we can't count to three, but it's difficult because most of us are used to seeing everything in the world in terms of binary numbers. We see things as yes or no. We see things as they know what mercury poison is or they don't know what mercury poison is. They know what BMI is. They don't know what BMI is. They eat a low-fat diet. They don't eat a low-fat diet. They're from a red state. They're from a blue state. Almost everything we look at for cognitive reasons ends up being seen in a binary way because it's easier for us. What I want to challenge us to do is to think in terms of three different segments of people. And there's a yellow little handout on your table if you're more of a visual person than a verbal person. If you want to view this in terms of a triangle, that's a great way to do it. That at the very top, the tippy top of this little triangle, there's a group of consumers that I call vigilant consumers. Okay, and these vigilant consumers are the type of people who know everything you're talking about. They know what phytochemicals are. They know what level of mercury poisoning water ends up becoming difficult for us to look at. They know the problem of eating a low-fat diet. I mean, rather, of eating a high-fat diet. In fact, they can go out there and they can look at those bagels and they can tell you within about 5 calories how many calories one of those bagels has. But on the other extreme, the very other extreme, this is the other percent you were talking about, we end up having these people that really just don't care. If you were to say, you know, you should walk 10,000 steps a day, they're going to say, well, who are you to tell me that? Or, you know, you should not eat that pastry because it's loaded with fat. They're going to say, well, I don't care. Right? But what happens is there's this in-between group. It's sort of a swing group of voters you might want to look at. And this is the segment I think we usually typically ignore and we want to look at as consumers. And these end up being a segment that I call the conveniently concerned segment. Okay? They can be conveniently concerned if it's really easy to eat healthy, or they can be conveniently concerned if it comes to something that's very easy to buy. But in general, they're pretty much fair weather people. For instance, what we end up seeing is that this conveniently concerned people ends up being the largest set of dieters. These end up being the people who, maybe New Year's Day, they decide it's time to go on a diet. Okay, they're not the vigilant people that are watching things every day, but when it's convenient to eat carefully, or when the time is right, they end up eating a little bit more carefully. Okay. Now, what we end up having is that membership in these different groups is very fluid. So to see things as binary, to see things as black and white, people who appreciate the identity preservation of Maine lobsters, or people who just say, hey, all lobsters are the same, is wrong because there end up being these gradations, and you don't have to look in terms of an infinite number of gradations, but just seeing things in terms of three general groups will help you quite a bit. The problem we run into is that most of us are really, in the profession, are really vigilant. Okay, this ends up being about all we talk about, ends up being all we deal with when we talk with our friends, that's all they talk about. And so we talk about phytochemicals, and we expect everybody else to know what phytochemicals are. We end up talking about different issues related to food safety and biotechnology. We expect the rest of the world to kind of follow the same way. But what ends up happening is that when we end up assuming that people either get it or they don't get it, it really sort of biases the way we do things. And what it leads us to do is something that I call me marketing. And that is, we try to look at everybody in the world as essentially versions of ourselves. So we end up assuming that they have a similar level of knowledge, but either they just don't care. Or we end up thinking that they care about things that we just need to kind of give them that extra little push. In reality, most people typically are very different than we are. And a lot of the people we're trying to change, it's not really clear that they need to be changed. It may be good in some cases if we can bump people up levels, but it may not be necessary to kind of take them all the way up to the level of understanding that we have. Now, after kind of laying the groundwork of the importance of understanding this triangle, and that these three segments are nowhere close to being equal size. What I'd like to do is look a little bit about why we eat, how much we eat, and why we choose what we choose to eat. Now, in general, if you were to talk to most people and you say, hey, why do you overeat? Most people give you two reasons. They'd say, I overeat because the food is really, really good, or because I am really, really hungry. And you said, why do you do that? If you were to say, oh, really? Well, what do you think about the lighting around you or the people you're eating with, the size of the bowl, those influence you? And this ends up being a big danger in whether I'm really hungry and whether I really like the food. Just are not aware of the factors that end up influencing us because they're not logical, conscious decisions. The second thing that ends up influencing society end up doing is consumption cues that are suggested by our plate size, by what the person next to us is eating, by how long we spend at the table, end up being issues related to our ability to monitor food while we're eating. Now, the problem is, once we eat food, the evidence is gone. Okay, our tummies can't really do much counting. And as a result, once we eat something, there's nothing really left on the table to tell us whether we had 3 chicken wings or 4 chicken wings, whether we had 2 pieces of pizza or 5 pieces of pizza. And we did a study to look at this a while back where we developed some refillable soup bowls that refilled to the bottom of the table. And people, as they ate, of course, didn't know they were being refilled. And they came in for lunch and fed them soup. And after about 20 minutes, we stopped them. And they were sitting next to people who had normal-sized soup bowls. What would happen? These people would start eating, and level would drop down a little bit, and then they just keep kind of eating and slowly and perceptibly rise. And after 20 minutes, we'd stop these people, and they ate 73% more soup, okay? Because what was going on? But if you asked them, they didn't say they're any more full, nor did they estimate they'd eaten any more calories than the people eating out of the normal soup bowl. Because what happens is oftentimes we eyeball our food when we determine how much we're going to eat, and once we eyeball it, then all we do is we essentially eat until it's gone. Because it doesn't really make sense to sit there and kind of say, am I full yet? Am I full yet? Am I full yet? Because we want to eat and enjoy the food and enjoy the company of the people we're with. So as a result, what it appears that we tend to do is we target how much food we want to eat prior to beginning our meal. We serve ourselves, and then we eat till it's gone, and that's why we end up not monitoring it as we end up eating. So those are 2 reasons we eat how much we do. In terms of eating what we do and why we buy what we buy, we've been doing some research recently. And one thing we're kind of discovering that's sort of interesting is that each and every one of us, if we were to take a look at exactly what we had eaten at home for dinners over the past year or something like this, what we'd find is that for most every one of us, only 17 different meals comprise slightly over 80% of the dinners we end up eating. So one of those dinners for this lady might be meatloaf and potatoes with green beans. Well, that would be one of 17 meals that would be eaten among her portfolio or her menu that she would eat again and again and again. Now, for all of us, it's different people, but what it underscores is, for the most part, when we're shopping, we're buying the same things over and over and over. And you may be the president of the National Blueberry Association, but if you're trying to get people to eat blueberries, and that's not involved in one of the 17 meals that they eat over and over and over again, that should inform the strategy that you use, because it has to be something different rather than saying, hey, they got lots of phytochemicals in them. Antioxidants, huh? So we need to kind of keep that in mind, because we are very much creatures of habit. Not only what we eat, but also just in the meal preparation that we're comfortable doing. The third thing I want to talk briefly about is this issue of food safety and food scares. Now, if you end up looking at this triangle, okay, there are people who are tremendously vigilant about food, who, if the cookie falls on the floor, immediately pick it up and rush it to the waste paper basket, okay? There's this convenient group in the middle that when the cookie falls on the floor, they kind of, part of whether they're going to see it as a risk or not has to do with what the other options are. So they might look on the floor to see if the floor is very dirty. They might look on the counter to see if there's any other cookies on the counter. And then they make a decision whether that was a risky thing to make or not. And then there's a third group of unconcerned people who just snatch it up and eat it. There's also another name for this third group: males. just kidding. Okay. But when we look at this conveniently concerned group, there's actually 2 reasons that somebody can be conveniently concerned. okay, but have it not influence their behavior very much. They can be conveniently concerned because they just don't really perceive it as much of a risk, okay? And part of what influences whether we perceive something as a risk ends up being whether or not the options are very attractive. This was a few years ago, as professor of marketing and nutritional science at the University of Illinois, and I was inducted in the nutritional science group, and they had a picnic for me. And I thought, oh, this is great. It's a nice barbecue. Well, they ended up having, it went on a little bit long, and the chicken had been sitting out for a few hours. And so, the decision was whether or not we should eat this chicken, whether it's appropriate to eat. And so everybody's sort of chiming in on their formula as to whether the chicken's okay to eat. And then somebody says, well, what else do we have? And they said, well, there's chicken or there's tofu burgers. And it's like, that chicken's fine. No problem. Absolutely no problem at all. And a lot of what we do when we look at risk and food risk end up being what the other alternatives are around. And if we're at a restaurant and there's tuna and we think, oh, geez, there could be a problem with tuna. But if what's going on is that we don't like anything else on the menu, hey, guess what? We just recalculate the risk is a lot lower than it was before. Okay? That's one thing that's going on when we look at this conveniently concerned segment with respect to food safety and food scares. But a second thing that ends up going on is we need to realize that people have very different attitudes toward risk. I had done something a few years ago looking at people who parachute. And you think that people who skydive, you say, geez, they're just whacked out individuals. They have no idea how dangerous that is. And that's not true. In fact, what we end up finding is that their estimate of mortality based on skydiving wasn't a whole lot different than people who said, there's no way I'll ever jump from a perfectly fine plane with a parachute on. Okay? What happens, their just attitude toward risk itself was a lot different. And that ends up being the other component that we need to keep in mind. Now, in closing, I just want to talk about the role that we play in trying to influence people's lives. A while back, we did some research that looked at how signage in stores influences how much people buy. So we'd put signs up that would say, soup, no limit per person, or we'd put signs up in other stores that said, soup, limit 12 per person, and we'd find people would buy 3 cans if it said no limit, but if it said limit 12, people would buy 7 cans or 8 cans. We'd put signs up in Wawa's along the Central Coast here that said Snicker bars, buy some for the weekend, regular price. We'd put in other stores Snicker bars, buy 18 for the weekend, regular price. I mean, that's ridiculous. There's no reason why somebody should do this, yet any mention of a number in a sign ended up increasing how much people bought by 30%, doubling it in some cases. Now, in talking to somebody, with a journalist, they said, oh my gosh, so these companies are forcing us to buy twice as much as we should with these signs. What should the government do about that? And if you say, well, what is really the risk there? So I buy 7 cans of soup tomorrow instead of 3 cans of soup. It's not going to go bad. It's a little bit harder to carry home. But I think that that's what we need to kind of keep in mind, that even though people are influenced in a lot of ways that can be very subtle and that they're not aware of, what we have to realize is what is the danger of some of this happening. If it ends up being that we just buy 3 extra cans of soup a little earlier than we otherwise would, it may not really be worth getting too worried about.